Sarah, I came across your work a couple of years ago when I was listening to a podcast on my airplane away to Iceland. And then quickly afterwards, I read the book, This Is Your Brain on Birth Control Pill. This Is Your Brain on Birth Control. And then in preparation for this interview, I read The Period Brain. I thought I was somebody who understood women, but clearly I don't. So what do most people misunderstand about how female biology actually works?
Right. No, really, really great questions. And I'm sure that now that you have read those books, you probably know more than about 98% of men. So congratulations on that. I think that, one of the first things that people misunderstand about women is just not really understanding the nature of our hormonal variation and hormonal shifts and what that actually means for women. And I think that this has been something that has been downplayed in some ways because, there is this narrative that has existed in the world since, they started recording history, where the narrative was that women were, fickle and capricious and couldn't be trusted with important things like voting and land ownership because their hormones cycle, and therefore they're too emotional and they're too subject to the whims of their biology. But women do have hormones that cycle, but we're better off because of it. And so I think that one of the things that we need to do to really understand women is understand, one, why do we have hormones that cycle? And then two, what does the cyclical variation in our hormones do to the way that women think, feel, and experience the world around them?
Right. I was fascinated by reading about the follicular phase and the luteal phase. So can you just explain for those who are listening what the cycle looks like, the 28-day cycle, and how it impacts how women feel, behave, look, all of that?
Sure. So if we think about a menstrual cycle, and generally it has about 28 days, the first day of that cycle begins on a day that a woman gets her period. So that is cycle day 1. And at that point in the cycle, hormone levels are really low. So women have 2 primary sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And both these hormones are super low the day they get your period. And when hormone levels are low, that actually sends a signal to a woman's brain telling her that she's not pregnant and that also, she needs to get things moving along in order to ovulate. And so having low hormone levels tells women's brains to start telling the ovaries that they need to start stimulating egg follicles to prepare for the possibility of ovulation. And so that's what happens. The brain will start releasing these, what are known as releasing hormones, to the pituitary gland, which then signals to the ovaries, start stimulating egg follicles. And as egg follicles begin to mature to prepare for the possibility of ovulation, that leads to the release of women's first primary sex hormone, estrogen. And estrogen's job is to orient the female body and the female brain toward attraction and then sex. And the reason for this is that it's preparing the body and the brain for the period of time in the cycle in which sex can actually lead to conception. And this happens during what we know as, or what we call, the fertile window, right? And this is something that happens, or that is sort of marked in the cycle as being the 5 days prior to ovulation, and then the day of ovulation itself. And so estrogen has the effect of increasing women's energy levels. It makes women smell, sound, and look sexier to men. It increases women's sexual desire. Women tend to have more sex. They desire more sex. They tend to have better sex right near ovulation when estrogen is high. And that is because estrogen primes the brain and the body for sex, because this is the time that sex can lead to conception. And so this is the first half of the menstrual cycle. We call this the follicular phase. So again, that first day of your menstrual cycle being the day that you get your period. Egg follicles begin to mature, and as they do, estrogen levels rise. A dominant follicle takes over. It fully matures. Estrogen surges. That gets released. That's ovulation. And then after ovulation, that's the second half of your menstrual cycle. And the second half of the cycle is characterized by the release of women's second primary sex hormone, which is progesterone. And progesterone gets released from the empty egg follicle. So after, you have ovulation, then this little empty egg follicle starts producing progesterone. And this hormone rises and then peaks about 3 weeks after you get your period. So about the week before your period starts is when progesterone levels peak. And at that point, implantation will have occurred. So if a woman gets pregnant, at that point, progesterone levels stay high because the implanted embryo starts producing progesterone of its own. Or if a woman is not pregnant, which is usually the case, what will happen is that progesterone levels then fall. And so you can really think about the menstrual cycle as being characterized by the rise and fall of estrogen, again, which orients us toward attraction and sex because that's what's possible during that time. And then progesterone during the second half of the menstrual cycle, which is something that's being released and orients a woman's brain and body toward the possibility of implantation and pregnancy, sort of shifting gears like biologically and psychologically that way. During the last 2 weeks of the menstrual cycle. So the rise and fall of estrogen, the rise and fall of progesterone, and that's your cycle in a nutshell. And the reason that women have 2 primary sex hormones instead of 1 is just because our bodies have 2 different jobs to do in order to reproduce, right? We have to attract partners and have sex. And that is essentially the domain of estrogen, that hormone that peaks in the first half of the menstrual cycle. And then women's bodies also have to allow for implantation of an embryo and then pregnancy to occur. And that's something that's coordinated by our second primary sex hormone, progesterone, right? And so our menstrual cycles and our hormonal changes are the result of our body shifting gears between these 2 states that are required for the reproductive act, right? When men only need to have 1 primary sex hormone because men's bodies only have 1 thing they have to do to reproduce, and that is have sex. Right. And so men are just oriented toward that all the time, whereas women shift back and forth between oriented toward that in the first half of the menstrual cycle and then more toward energy conservation, rest, and preparing for the possibility of pregnancy in the second half of the cycle.
Very, very interesting. And your most recent book, The Period Brain, talks about PMS and how there isn't like that your mood decreases, that your sex drive decreases, that your body burns extra. I think it was up to 11% of more calories. Mm-hmm. And you were basically suggesting ways on how to buffer or mitigate the effects that the second half of the cycle has on women, right?
Yeah. So, most of us have this idea that all of our needs, like when it comes to how we're supposed to be taking care of ourselves and what our body needs and how much food we need to eat and how much rest we need to have, most of the advice that women are given about what they should be doing to take good care of themselves and take good care of their bodies is based on the idea that we have an unchanging biology, right? Like we aren't told like, oh, here's your, you should have this many calories a day in the first half of the menstrual cycle and this many calories in the second half of the cycle. You need this many hours of sleep during the first half of the menstrual cycle. You need this many hours of sleep in the second half of the menstrual cycle. Instead, we're just told you need to do this, you need to do that, right? It's like one size fits all. And the reason that a lot of women feel really terrible in the second half of the menstrual cycle in the luteal phase, so during that week or 2 weeks prior to getting their periods, is because we are essentially treating ourselves or following a set of rules that were never made with a cyclical creature like a human being in mind, like a human female, in mind. And the result of this is that women generally aren't eating enough in the second half of the menstrual cycle. They're not sleeping enough or spending enough time in recovery in the second half of the menstrual cycle. And we have this big, huge rise and fall of progesterone in the second half of the menstrual cycle that is 7 to 10 times greater than the rise and fall of hormones that happen in the first half of the cycle. cycle. And so it's like our body has a lot going on during that time. And when we're trying to care for ourselves using one size fits all, guidelines about eat and exercise and sleep, a lot of times we feel really terrible because we're not actually giving our bodies what they need during this time. And so just to give an example of this, one of the things that women oftentimes talk about in the second half of the menstrual cycle that bothers them as this idea of PMS is that they have food cravings. And a lot of women who have food cravings are craving calorie-dense foods because they're not eating enough. Because as you noted, our basal metabolic rate increases between 7 and 11% during this time, which means our body is burning through sometimes an additional 200 calories a day. And if you're not eating enough and your body thinks that it's preparing for the possibility of pregnancy, it's going to be screaming at you, saying like, feed me, feed me. And women, meanwhile, because we've only been told like, oh, you need this many number of calories a day, and we haven't been told that it varies, we start to have food cravings because our body is screaming for more and we're telling it no. And so one of the things that I think that can really improve women's experiences in the second half of the menstrual cycle is just really learning to tune in and believe their body. Because, a lot of what women have been taught and trained by the medical establishment, which so frequently doubts the experiences that we have and, discounts the symptoms that we have, that women have like learned to think that their body is the enemy and they don't trust what it's telling them. And so one of the lessons from the period brain is just really like learn to believe your body. And if it feels sleepier and hungrier in the second half of the menstrual cycle, that probably means that you need to be eating more and getting more rest. And so just learning to really dial into those things and support your body as you move through your cycle.
Yeah, I was, when I read the study, I don't know if you remember, you were citing a study that did like the difference between strength programs based on where they were on the cycle. So if I remember correctly, it was high dose of strength training in for each one group on like specific where they were in the cycle, and then they're reversed, so low dose. And basically the conclusion was that the women that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm reflecting on this wrong, women who in the follicular phase, if they're doing high strength training compared to if they're doing high dose strength training on the luteal phase, they increased 40% of their strength compared to 27% of the second group, which is like about 13% difference. And you also talked about it was a game changer for your own life to like change your exercise program based on where you are in the phase.
Yeah. So what that research found was that they essentially took two groups of women and they randomly assigned the two groups to either do most of their strength training in the first half of the menstrual cycle when estrogen is high, so days like 1 to 14 of the cycle, or the other group they assigned to do most of their strength training during the last 2 weeks of the menstrual cycle, so days 15 to 28. And essentially, having women do heavy lifting when estrogen is the primary sex hormone, or having them do their heavy lifting when progesterone is the primary sex hormone. And so all of the women over the course of the study did the exact same number of strength training exercises. It's just that whether they were heavy loading them in, which half of the cycle is the only way that they differed. And what they found was that the group that did and sort of front loaded strength training days to really prioritize days where estrogen is their primary sex hormone, so during that follicular phase of the cycle, the first 14 days, that those women had significantly greater strength gains than what was found for the other group. And this was something that, definitely has had an impact on me in my own life. And in part because I hate strength training when, and especially I find this to be true in the second half of the menstrual cycle. It's harder for me. It feels worse. It was something that I would always have to force myself into doing. Like I'd have to talk myself into like, okay, you're really tired and you have no energy, but okay, go and lift the weights. And I decided at some point after, struggling through yet another luteal phase related strength training day that I was going to try to do most of my heavy strength training in the first half of the menstrual cycle, and then leave the second half to just doing more sort of restorative types of activities, taking long walks. And it's not that I would just like not work out. I would do what my body was telling me to do. And what I found was that I actually ended up getting stronger, which was really a big surprise for me. Like I was able to increase the amount of weight that I was including in my reps, especially on for me the biggest changes were like upper body strength training. I got significantly stronger when I switched things up, where I really prioritized heavy lifting in the first half of the cycle, and then prioritized the restorative work in the second. And I don't know, if it's just that I took, taking a little bit of a break every couple of weeks is just good for me generally. But there's a lot of reasons also to believe that estrogen will help facilitate muscle growth to a greater extent than will progesterone, just simply because some of the pathways that estrogen targets in terms of different types of pathways that produce muscle growth are consistent with the idea that it is supportive of muscle growth in ways that progesterone is not. But I definitely found that to be a game changer in terms of not only making me stronger, but also making me like exercising more. Exercise has been a central part of my life for the last 25 years, or 30 years. So it's been an important part of my life for a long time. But strength training in particular has always not been my favorite. And this has definitely made it feel a lot more palatable to me, to be able to really focus it in one part of the cycle and then tap the brakes on it a little bit in the other.
Yeah. The other thing that captured my mind is that you can reference the study or how you personally experience this, but it seems to me that women need to be more self-compassionate on the luteal phase, because they direct their attention to their body parts, for example, that they don't like, right?
Yeah, that study was so funny to me because I saw the results of this study that I'll tell you and your listeners about here in a moment. And it was one of those things where you see the results of a research study and you're like, yeah, no, that's me. And so what this study did was it had women standing in bathing suits in front of a mirror and looking at themselves. And before they had done this, the researchers asked women about what their favorite parts of their bodies were, and then what the least favorite parts of their bodies were. And what the researchers found, and they also asked women questions about where they were in their menstrual cycle. So they knew whether they were in the estrogen-fueled first half of the menstrual cycle, or whether they were in the progesterone-fueled second half of the menstrual cycle. And what they found was that for women who were in the estrogenic follicular phase, where, again, the body is sort of primed for sex and attraction, during that time, women didn't pay any attention to the parts of the body that they didn't like. And they paid most attention to the parts of their body that they did like. It's almost like estrogen is like, hey, there's a party going on. And like the brain doesn't want to stop the party, right? By looking at something it doesn't like, right? It's just going to look at all of its favorite features and keep the good time going. What they found with women in the luteal phase of the cycle is that women could not tear their eyes away from the parts of their body that they liked the least. And so it's like they're really focused on the things about themselves that they see as being imperfect and undesirable. And for any woman who's had this experience of being in the second half of the menstrual cycle and just not feeling like their best, this is not a time that women generally feel particularly sexy or really good about themselves. And so you add to that then we have this cognitive bias where we're focusing specifically on the things about ourselves that we don't like. It can really create sort of a perfect storm of self-loathing that many women have had in that second half of the menstrual cycle.
Yeah, I think it was also another study that I think they were like drawing a picture of, and the picture that they draw was more sexier when they were on the follicular phase than extra.
Yeah, so when estrogen is high, they had women come into the research lab and draw They gave them like a stick figure drawing, and then they gave them some colored pencils, and they had them draw on the figure like what it is that they would wear to a party that night. And what they found is that when women drew that, when they were close to ovulation, when estrogen was really high in the cycle, and again, this is that time in the cycle when sex can lead to conception, that women drew outfits that were significantly sexier and revealed more skin than what women drew when they were in the second half of the menstrual cycle. And what was also really interesting about that study was that the researchers also took pictures of women and took pictures of the women when they came into the lab of what they were wearing when they came to the research lab that day. And what they found was that the women who were near high fertility in the cycle, again, when estrogen was high, that they were also revealing more skin and dressed more sexy as they were going into the research lab on high fertility days compared to what they were on low fertility days of the cycle.
That's fascinating.
Totally fascinating.
Yeah. Talking about sex, we are one of the few mammals that continue to have sex on the luteal phase. But it has maybe, as you said, mentioned in the book, it has different purposes based on, or different motivation, if I can phrase it like that, in the follicular phase compared to the luteal phase.
Yes. Yeah. So it's so interesting because, humans, of course, we have cycles, and women only have about roughly 5 days every cycle that sex can lead to conception. And that is that fertile window, which generally starts around days 8 or 9 of the menstrual cycle, and then lasts until right after ovulation. So within 24 hours of ovulation itself. And during this time with human females, we find that, women do have higher sexual desire, and they're more likely to have sex during this time than outside of this window. And this is because estrogen levels are very high, and estrogen has the effect of increasing sexual desire in the brain, et cetera, et cetera. But what's interesting about humans is that this is not the only time in the cycle that we have sex. And most species, especially most mammalian species, what we tend to see is that the females will only be sexually receptive during this time when sex can lead to conception. And that outside of that period of time, which, like with a dog, you call it being in heat. In other species, you call it estrus, this period of time when females are sexually receptive. And then when sex cannot lead to conception, it's just like, the door to sex closes like a book. And there's no sexual activity that goes on for the females until she's back to being sexually receptive. Human females have sex throughout the cycle, right? Regardless of whether they are fertile or not in their cycle, women tend to have sex. And so this actually makes us pretty unique. There's only a handful of other species that do this. And so this, of course, begs the question of why. And what the research suggests is that having sex throughout the menstrual cycle, so even during these periods of time when sex cannot lead to conception, that this is something that helps to function to promote pair bonding within the couple. And we know that that pair bonds have played a really important role in terms of promoting the survivability of children. And throughout our evolutionary history, there's been a lot of research that's been done looking at the health and welfare of children growing up in single versus two-parent households, both in our contemporary environment, and then also looking at people growing up in contemporary hunter-gatherer groups that look a lot like what we think our ancestors used to live like. And what you see is that regardless of the type of environment, whether it's a hunter-gatherer type of an environment or whether it's a contemporary environment, that survivorship of children is higher when you have two parents around. And the well-being and, all of the other different indicators of performance, success, and health are greater in two-parent households compared to single-parent households. And this just simply is telling us that having pair bonds is something that has played a really important role in terms of promoting offspring success throughout our evolutionary past. And what that means is that it puts a lot of it sort of reinforces the necessity of pair bonding in order to raise successful offspring. That was a lot of biological mumbo jumbo, but what essentially what it's saying is that like it's good when you have children to have a relationship partner to help to care for the children. The children do better, and the parents do better generally when they're in a committed relationship. And so sex helps to really solidify those bonds. And there's a lot of research that finds that sexual behavior does actually serve as important glue that holds relationships together. And there's also research that finds that in particular, sex, that women, in particular, when we talk about this with women, sex that women have in the second half of the menstrual cycle, when in the luteal phase, when sex cannot lead to conception, that one of the reasons that women have sex during this period is particularly because it does serve that bonding function, and that it can promote bonding and in a relationship during a time when a woman's brain and body is really oriented toward the possibility of pregnancy and the need for offspring care. And so, we're a little bit different than many species of sexually reproducing organisms, just because we do have sex throughout the cycle, and that non-conceptive sex functions to promote pair bonding.
Yeah, I think sexual experience with your partner has like up to 48 hours effect on, or like related to relationship satisfaction, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, no, there's this really great work by Andrea Meltzer and her lab at Florida State, where they find that that when you have sex with your partner, you get this sexual afterglow, which is this feeling of relationship satisfaction that you get that lasts beyond the period of sex itself. And what they find is that it lasts 24 to 48 hours after the sexual encounter, and it has the effect of increasing relationship satisfaction and ultimately leading to greater relationship satisfaction over time. And so what they find is that for couples who have a strong sexual afterglow, right, where they get that warm, fuzzy feeling from intimacy with your partner, that the longer that this lasts and continues to have this rosy glow on the quality of the relationship itself, that this can lead to greater relationship satisfaction over time.
Yeah, and one interesting question that came into my mind is that, after sex, I think you mentioned that oxytocin peaks like 40 minutes after, if I'm remembering correctly. Is that the reason why? I'm talking as a guy and as a man, and sometimes men don't want to like lay in the bed for long after having sex, and women tend to like that, and men who are good men provide that to their women. But is that maybe the main reason why that is?
Yeah, that's so interesting. So I don't know. So yes, oxytocin, you do get a peak in oxytocin after sexual activity. And to answer your question about laying around, and, I don't know. And it could be that that the effects of oxytocin do have more, because it can have like sort of a warm, fuzzy feeling, and warm, fuzzy could make you just want to curl up and take a nap. But it could also not. One thing that I think that's really interesting that I've heard about oxytocin and like sort of its effects on the sexual relationship is that, regardless of what you feel about somebody that you have sex with. So imagine that this is your long-term committed relationship partner, or imagine that this is just somebody you're having a casual encounter with. The oxytocin release is actually the same in both contexts. But that it's a combination of the top-down feelings of how you feel about the person interacting with the oxytocin to impact whether or not it leads to bonding. So it's not like oxytocin automatically leads to bonding. It's oxytocin plus I like this person that produces the bonding response. And you can get the oxytocin response from sex, but it doesn't actually lead to bonding if it's not somebody that you're bonded to.
Interesting. So has less effect when you're not, you don't like the person.
Right, you don't like the person, right? Exactly. I mean, it's like post nut clarity, right? Like everybody's heard that, and which for listeners who don't know what that is, it's after you have sex with somebody that you thought you were super attracted to, and then you have sex with them, and then you're like, what was I thinking? Like this person is not what I thought they were, you're still getting oxytocin release in that context. It's just that there you have like, here's this person I'm kind of ambivalent about, and then you have this experience, and then all of a sudden the blinders come off, and that's significantly more likely to happen for men than it is for women. And there's evolutionary reasons for that, right? And that is that for men, the benefits of a short-term casual sexual encounter are so great. Because historically that could lead to a low-cost reproductive opportunity. That for men, like having a brain that deceives you into believing that you're really into somebody, if it's going to lead to a sexual encounter, I mean, that's kind of evolutionarily a win, right? But for women, you generally get the opposite effect, where if you have a sexual encounter with somebody, it tends to lead you to be more closely bonded to the person, regardless of what you initially thought of them. And that's because historically for women, the costs of sex were so great, just because, we grew, like most of our evolutionary history was spent without reliable birth control. And so sex was always very costly for women because it could potentially lead to having this child that now they have to grow and then raise, potentially without the help of somebody else investing.
That's so interesting. What happens to men's testosterone during that process? Like, because I think anticipated sex at least increases, if I'm not.
Yeah, no, anticipating sex increases testosterone for sure. For sure. And then you get a dip after sexual release.
Interesting. So that's, okay. So from an evolutionary perspective and the biological perspective. So what came to mind? Is there a research-backed ideal amount that partners should have sex? How frequently?
No, there's a lot of research on this topic. So everybody always wants to know the answer to that because everybody's always worried that they're not normal, or else they're worried that they're not getting enough or they're getting too much. And really, this is one of those things where it is best negotiated within the context of a relationship, because it's really about like how much is necessary for you. So some people, in order to feel sexually connected with their partner, they need to have sex with their partner fairly frequently, right? They need to have sex with their partner 4 or 5 times a week, right? Or 2 or 3 times a week. Other people don't need to have sex with their partner as frequently to feel connected to their partner. So they need to have sex with their partner once a week or even like once a month. And some people don't need to have sex very frequently at all. And so like in terms of what is optimal for your relationship and keeping your relationship really connected intimately with your partner, it's something that's really going to just depend on each of you and what your own individual needs are. But there is a lot of research that suggests that regular sexual activity, however you want to define that, is really positive in terms of promoting bonding within relationships and then just the health and satisfaction of long-term relationships.
I see. And the interesting question I have is that, when do you just follow your needs when they're calling to you and not schedule, but like life gets busy and like,
right.
What is the trade-off? Like, would it be beneficial to somebody listening to schedule it, or is it the magic of like following your emotional state?
Everybody's got different things, and it's really interesting because I think that what the research, when you look at the human sexuality research, it kind of tells us the same thing that you see in medicine, which is there's really no one-size-fits-all approach that's going to work for everybody. And for some people, scheduling sex is the most unromantic, unsexy thing that they could possibly do. And so they would respond very negatively to that. Other people really like that because it takes the pressure off of feeling like they're being chased by their partner or feeling like they're chasing their partner, because that can be a really common response that people have where they feel like they're being pursued or like that they're constantly pursuing. And so taking that off the table and just knowing that like this day or these days a week, are the days that we do this, and as a way to keep that going in the relationship can be really positive. And so, really, it's a matter of negotiating this within the context of your relationship to do something that works for both you and your partner. But knowing that these things, different people respond well to this, and other people don't respond well to this. So this is certainly something that can go on the table, right, in terms of the discussion about ways to keep a healthy sexual relationship within a long-term pair bond.
Yeah, and I love that because there's so many. Because most people, like you say, are looking for exact moment of how much they should have sex, but then as a researcher, there's like maybe 100 other factors that influence that.
Right. Yeah, and everybody's just so different. And so it's really about communicating with your partner and about like what is going to work for your partner, what works for you, and like how do you meet in the middle? Because not everybody is always going to be on the same page, and it's going to change over time. And that's like another thing that I think that people sometimes forget is that they need to be constantly, and not constantly like every day, like, every Tuesday, like, let's talk about sex. But, you need to check in with your partner because people's needs change, their lives change, their stress levels change. And it's like good to check in to see where everybody is at and, how everyone's feeling. Like, are you feeling or how am I feeling? Like, are we meeting our needs being met? Like, what do we need to do differently? And just really being proactive about finding ways to work together to maintain the quality of the relationship, both sexual relationship and then the larger relationship.
Yeah, it's just so funny because when you're talking, like I have many buddies and some of them really like once a month, once every 2 weeks, whatever. But then I have one friend that came to my mind. He's like, if he would choose, he would do it for 3 hours every day.
Yeah.
And he's been with his wife for like many, many years.
Yeah. And she's the one over there who looks really exhausted.
But when we talk about relationship satisfaction with him, he's just like, it's just directly, I'm going to use the causal language in everyday life, but like it's directly related how happy he is in his relationship.
Right. Oh, I mean, it can be such an important part to people's relationships. And again, what's so interesting about it is again, how much variability there is, because just for some people, it's like super central, like you were saying with your friend, where it's like, the mood can really be affected by the extent to which they're feeling that their sexual needs are met. And for other people, it's just really not that important. And they don't really think about it one way or the other. And so the thing to really understand is who you are and then who your partner is, and then finding ways to be able to, if you're not perfectly aligned, ways that you can meet in the middle where everybody's feeling like they're having their needs met.
Mm-hmm. I want to move us a little bit to mate choice and how that different cycles affect what women look for when it comes to sex and mating, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, women, when they're looking for a romantic partner, right? So you're going to be choosing a partner. Women, just like men, have to make trade-offs, right? And essentially all women want it all, right? They want to have a romantic partner who's really sexy and got like the chiseled features that we tend to think of as being like hyper masculinized, right? Like, so like the deep set eyes, broad jaw, broad shoulders, tall, strong, deep voice, charismatic, socially dominant type personality. But they also want somebody who's going to be really caregiving and be a good father and be a good provider and be faithful. And so it's like, there's a lot that we're looking for in our romantic partners. And the fact is that, we're not always going to be able to get everything all at once. And this just, like strikes at the heart of the fact that there's always going to be trade-offs within a relationship, right? And every time that we're choosing a partner, we're choosing somebody who has a combination of qualities that we're able to live with, right? Like this person has enough of the sexy features where I feel really attracted to them, but they also have enough of these sort of caregiving, providing types of qualities where I'm also going to feel like they'll be a good partner to me and that they're going to be a good cooperator and they're going to be invested. And if we have children, they'll be a good father, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it turns out that women's sex hormones actually impact the extent to which women sort of notice and are attracted to different types of male qualities. And in particular, what the research finds is that when estrogen is high across the cycle, So when estrogen is dominant, which again tends to happen in the first half of the menstrual cycle, particularly near ovulation, ovulation generally happens around day 14. Ovulation is at its highest point in the cycle, usually between days 9 to 14 or 15 in the cycle. And at that time, women's brains are sort of primed to be drawn to qualities related to things like masculinity and genetic compatibility. And it's essentially like looking at all of these types of cues that would help promote the success of offspring by way of getting access to what we call good genes, right? So women are looking for men who have immune genes that are different than their own. And this is something that women can pick up on via cues like scent. So there's some scent-based cues to genetic compatibility. Women are able to pick up on cues related to masculinity and testosterone levels in ways that women are less sensitive to in the second half of the menstrual cycle. So for example, research finds that when estrogen is high in the menstrual cycle, that women have a heightened preference for masculinized male faces. So again, broad jaw, deep set eyes, masculinized male voices. So deep male voices, masculinized male behaviors. So again, like socially dominant types of behaviors. Women really like those when estrogen is high. And again, it's hypothesized that the reason for this is that estrogen, of course, rises during times when sex can lead to conception. And during this time, that women should be oriented toward men who have qualities related to good genes. And the second half of the menstrual cycle, when progesterone is the primary sex hormone, this is when the body and brain are oriented toward pregnancy. At this point, all of those masculinized cues become less important to women, and they actually become more drawn to and interested in men possessing cues related to investment potential. So is this somebody who might be a good father? Is this somebody who's going to be a good partner to me? Is this somebody who's caring? Is this person loving? Are they going to be investing? And essentially what this means is that, for women, we're always making trade-offs about when we're choosing, especially a long-term romantic partner, right? Where we're looking for somebody who's going to be sexy and have some of these qualities related to good genes. And that's also going to be a good provider, caregiver, and partner. And that, as our cycle shifts, it sort of nudges our attention to be paying attention to different types of those qualities, with the, conception and high fertility within the cycle being related to the preference for the sexy masculinized males, and then sort of having their preferences nudged a little bit toward a heightened preference for caregiving and providing in the second half of the menstrual cycle. And essentially, this, like, what does this mean on a day-to-day basis? Like, do women feel like they need to switch partners every 14 days? Like, no. But instead, it's just that, like, what our brain is most attuned to and the types of things that we're most attracted to in that moment can shift a little bit. And this means that if you have a male partner and you're a woman, you might notice his really sexy, back during the first half of the cycle, and like, wow, like, ooh, look at that. And then in the second half of the cycle, you're just like, he just loaded the dishwasher, and you're like, yes, like that is my guy right there. And so essentially it's, it's like different parts of our brain get kind of the volume turned up or down depending on what's happening hormonally, with, the estrogen being related to qualities related to good genes and sexiness, and then progesterone being more related to long-term caregiving and provisioning.
Really interesting. And I think it does predict different things, whether you pick your partner on the estrogen phase or the progesterone phase, right? Yeah.
No, so there's not really any, because, most of the time when women are choosing their partners, it's not like they're choosing who they're going to marry, like on let's say day 10 of the cycle when estrogen is high, and then they're going to marry them. And then on day 20 of the cycle when progesterone is high, that they're going to be like, oh my God, I made a terrible mistake. Instead, what generally happens is, like, who you're most drawn to initially, might be impacted by cycle phase, but that person has to be able to outlast more than one menstrual cycle, and so generally, the way you can think about cycles effects on partner choice is that you're getting a vote, right, by both parts of your brain, right? The parts of your brain that are looking for really good genes and sexiness. And then you're also getting a vote being cast by the parts of your brain that are really drawn to long-term pair bonding and provisioning. And so as we cycle, if we're with somebody who has enough of each of those types of qualities to be able to pass the test, right, and get a vote from those different parts of our brain that are looking for different types of qualities, then we're generally going to do pretty well in terms of our choice of partner. And we're not going to feel you're not going to have buyer's remorse, right? Every time that you go into the luteal phase, or every time you go into the follicular phase. Where there are some interesting kinds of differences is like with hormonal birth control, because with hormonal birth control, you're taking a naturally cycling woman who, again, sort of shifts between these states that are dominated by estrogen, which is related to this heightened preference for qualities related to sexiness. And then, cycling then into progesterone, which is more oriented toward provisioning and long-term caregiving. You take that woman and you shut down her hormone production, which is what you do with hormonal birth control because it prevents you from ovulating. And ovulation is the process by which the female body produces most of its sex hormones. So when you shut that down and then you replace it with a daily dose of synthetic hormones, a relatively high level of synthetic progesterone known as progestin, and a relatively low level of estrogen, this can, blunt women's preference for cues related to sexiness and genetic compatibility, right? Because we know that that's like estrogen's kind of like wheelhouse. Like that's like its expertise is that it turns on the parts of our brain that are really dialed into genetic compatibility and genetic quality. And when you turn the volume down on that, that means that women are no longer really paying that much attention or directing that much energy toward, determining like, is this somebody who's genetically compatible? Is this somebody who's, got, the kinds of sexy genes that I'm looking for? And instead, that women tend to prioritize the qualities related to long-term pair bonding, like provisioning ability and partnership ability and good parenting, et cetera, et cetera. And there is some evidence that suggests that when women use hormonal birth control, that they do prefer less masculinized male faces, voices, and behaviors compared to what you see in naturally cycling women. And this means that if you're using hormonal birth control, it could potentially have an impact ultimately on who you partner with.
Mm. And then what happens if you are on the pill when you choose and then go off the pill?
And that's the $8 million question, right? Is if you choose your partner when you're on hormonal birth control and your preference for qualities related to testosterone, for example, and genetic compatibility is blunted, and then all of a sudden you go off of it, what's going to happen to your attraction to your current partner? And the research on this is mixed, but the research suggests that it can change your attraction to your partner. And whether that change is positive, so you feel more attracted to your partner, or whether that change is negative, it makes you feel less attracted to your partner, depends on how sexy your partner is. And so there was a study that was done that looked at this longitudinally in a study of married couples and looked at married couples who got together when the woman was on the pill. And then they looked at what happened when women went off of it. And they found that for about and I forget exactly what the percentages were in their study, but what they found was that it did lead to changes in sexual attraction and relationship satisfaction within their relationship, and that for women who were partnered with attractive guys, that their attraction to their partner and relationship satisfaction actually increased when they went off of hormonal birth control, because it's like the blinders came off and all of a sudden they could see their sexy partner for what he was, right? And all of a sudden they're just like super dialed into it. And they're like, yes, And then for women who had less attractive partners, they found the opposite, in that women reported less sexual attraction to their partners and less relationship satisfaction. And that was from a longitudinal study of married couples that was done probably 10 years ago now. More recently, we did a study in my lab where we looked at women who chose their partners when they were using hormonal birth control. So that half the sample chose their partners when they were using hormonal birth control. The other half chose their partners when they were not using hormonal birth control. And then we looked at changes in partner attraction for women who discontinued use when they chose their partner when they were on it. And what we found was actually really interesting. And that was about, for most women who discontinue hormonal birth control, even if they chose their partner when they were on it, they don't really notice any differences in attraction to their partner. But what we did find was that for about 20% of women, they reported that it increased their attraction to their partner. Again, these are probably the women who are married to really sexy guys. And then for 20%, it decreased their attraction to their partner. And so what this tells us is that for some women, when they're using hormonal birth control, it can impact who they're attracted to enough of a degree where it causes noticeable changes in attraction after discontinuing it, right? But for the majority of women, even though our hormones influence attraction, they don't have such a noticeable impact on attraction for these women where they even notice a difference in attraction when they go off of it. And so I think that the hopeful message here, like the one that I hope that people listen to, is that if you chose your partner on hormonal birth control and you go off it, chances are things are going to be just fine. Right? The odds are in your favor that things are going to be just fine. It's just that in some cases, it can lead to changes. And about half the time, those changes are really positive and you feel better and it makes everything even greater. And the other half of the time, it can make things worse. And so just being aware that that's a possibility and then sort of adjusting and strategizing your hormonal birth control in accordance with that.
Yeah, it's so interesting because when I think about that and in my past relationship and everything, it's not just about start using condom and not using condom. It's just like it can influence way more. So I think like being mindful of that and having conversation of that could be really beneficial. How about in terms of the mate choice? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong because I'm trying to learn here. I think it's when you choose a a little bit dissimilar, not a partner with like how you smell and stuff, but when you go on the birth control pill, that gets blunted, so you choose a more similar mate. Can you explain that maybe?
Yeah. So one of the things that women are hypothesized to be able to pick up on with a man's scent. Which just to circle around this idea for a moment first, women are a lot more sensitive to scent-based cues than men. And so there's been research on this now for a number of years, just showing that scent plays a more important role in partner choice for women than it does for men, and that women are more sensitive to it. Like they just like the way or don't like the way that somebody smells. And one of the things that is believed to be part of what a person is picking up on when they're picking up on another person's scent has to do with their major histocompatibility genes. And major histocompatibility genes play an important role in the immune cells and the types of antigen receptors on the surfaces of those cells. So what does that mean? Our immune cells, our white blood cells, have these little proteins on the outside that are able to detect and recognize pathogens. And the more diverse our MHC genes, our major histocompatibility genes, so the more the more different that the genes are that we have, the greater number of different pathogens or germs or bad guys, immunological bad guys, that our immune system is able to pick up on. And so if you're partnered with somebody who has different MHC genes than you, that means that your children, because these genes tend to be co-dominantly expressed, which just means that all of the genes get expressed, not just one copy, because in a lot of parts of our body, just one copy of a gene gets expressed and the other one doesn't. With MHC genes, both mom and dad's genes get expressed. And so if you partner with somebody who has different MHC genes than you do, then your children are going to be able to recognize a greater number of pathogens than you would if your partner's MHC genes were the same as yours. Okay, and so what the research finds is that, when women who are cycling, so a woman not using hormonal birth control, when they're at the estrogenic point in the cycle, so again, this follicular phase, right near ovulation, when estrogen is high, women tend to exhibit a heightened preference for the scent of men who have different immune genes than them, in particular, different MHC genes. And it's been hypothesized that, again, this is the case of women picking up on a cue that would be related to the result of being able to produce healthy offspring with this person. And that estrogen is heightening our sensitivity to these cues during a time in the menstrual cycle when sex can actually lead to conception, right? And then when you move outside of that time in the cycle when sex can lead to conception, we aren't as sensitive to those cues. So it's like the brain turns up the volume on our ability to detect these differences when estrogen's high. And then when estrogen decreases, because conception is no longer possible, the brain turns the volume down on that detection ability because it's not necessary, because who cares? Because you can't get pregnant anyway. Right. And so what the research finds with respect to women who are using hormonal birth control is that they perpetually have the volume turned down on this. Right. So they don't ever get this heightened ability to be able to tell the difference between similar and dissimilar men in terms of their MHC genes. And so the result could be, and now nobody has really studied this, they haven't studied the downstream consequences of this, but in theory, this would potentially lead women who are using hormonal birth control to choose partners who are more genetically similar to themselves on these MHC genes compared to what happens by women who are cycling. And nobody has looked at that particular question. They have looked at the question of whether or not women who are using hormonal birth control are less good at being able to sniff out essentially genetically compatible mates. And there is some evidence that suggests that they are less able because they're not as sensitive to those cues. But we don't know whether or not this is actually leading to meaningful changes or differences in actual partner choice. And whether or not it's leading then to differences in the health of children, because that's another really interesting follow-up question on that, right? Which is, if it's true that women who are using hormonal birth control, that they are less attuned to, signs of genetic compatibility, might that then mean that it's more difficult for them to get pregnant? Is it more difficult for them to maintain a pregnancy? Do their children, once they're born, have a greater number of health problems? These are research questions that we really don't have answers to just yet.
It's really interesting. What is your view on the hookup culture from your research and lens?
Hookup culture is so interesting and sad. I think that a hookup culture is really got a lot of different contributing factors. I think one of them is that the rise of dating apps has made people see potential romantic partners as disposable, just because there's always another one. As soon as you swipe, there's going to be another face that pops up. And so I think that we've come to devalue the individuals that we end up in any type of a relationship with, because we feel like there's 8,000 alternatives that are out there, and it makes us less willing to put up with even minor imperfections. And it makes us view other people as more disposable. So I think that people are I think people are more reluctant to commit to relationships because they feel like there might be something better around the corner because of all of the swiping. And I also think that, another part of this is that I'm just gonna, my brain is a little bit fried. Just give me a minute, and then we can cut this part, and you can snip me in looking smart. So I think dating apps are a big part of the issue. I also think that, hormonal birth control and just being able to protect ourselves against pregnancy has definitely led women to be less sexually cautious than what they used to be. Historically, for women, sex was potentially always very costly because of the possibility that they would end up with an unwanted pregnancy. And the advent of hormonal birth control, which has certainly, it's got like a pretty low failure rate. It's like 98% effective when used correctly. So it takes a lot of the risk out of sexual behavior. And so I think that has opened women up to engaging in more short-term casual sexual behavior than what has happened historically. And so I think that the combination of more, I guess, the combination of less costly sex, right? Because now neither men nor women have to, there's not a lot of cost of sexual behavior anymore because, you're taking pregnancy off the table. And so that makes sex less costly. The combination of less costly sex plus ease of access to partners from dating apps, I think has led to fewer people being willing to commit to a long-term relationship and more willing to be able to just consent and live with short-term casual relationships.
And does short-term casual relationships have different effect on men and women?
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's a lot of research that shows that men are more open to and more desiring of short-term casual sexual relationships, just simply because men have inherited a greater tendency to have a preference for sexual variety. And the reasons for this are, of course, that novel sexual partners, so getting access to new sexual partners, has historically been the primary way by which men can increase the number of offspring that they have. Because with each new partner, there's a new reproductive opportunity. Whereas for women, no matter how many sexual partners you have, it's not going to give you a greater number of offspring than what you would have from having one fertile partner. Right? If a woman chooses one good partner, she can have just as many surviving offspring as if she had 100 partners, right? Whereas for men, a man with one good partner will have many fewer offspring than a man who has 100 partners, just because a man's reproductive success is limited to that of the number of partners that he has access to, because women's bodies are the rate limiting factor when it comes to reproduction. And so I forgot, I've been in meetings all morning and so my brain is fried. I don't remember what I was talking about. I was talking about men having, so I'm talking about men having a greater desire for sexual variety. Men have a greater desire for sexual variety because they can increase the number of offspring that they have simply by gaining access to new partners. And women do not have that ability, right? Women's reproduction is completely limited by the limits of their own reproductive biology. This has led men to have a greater preference for sexual novelty, and a more openness and being more desiring of short-term casual sexual relationships than women. And this doesn't mean that women don't ever want these, right? Because certainly they do. But instead, it just goes to show that there's a little bit of an asymmetry between the sexes in the desirability of these types of setups relative to establishing a longer-term, more long-term relationship.
Makes sense. If I'm a single man listening to this, what could I do today to increase the likelihood that I will attract the mate that I want in the future? What could I do?
I mean, it depends. It depends on what you want. If you're looking for a long-term romantic partner, I think that the best thing that you can possibly do is, one, be willing to be a long-term romantic partner, because, that's something that women are generally looking for is somebody who's committed within the context of their relationship. Commitment is something that women prioritize in relationships to a greater extent than men. And because of this, simply by making that something that's available to women, right? By being somebody who's willing to commit, you can actually increase the quality of women that you're able to get access to. Because if you're a man who's not willing to commit, the most desirable woman that you'll be able to get is here, right? Whereas if you're a man who's willing to commit, like, because that's going to open the pool of available women to you to be much greater, because that's something that women really value. And so being, somebody who's willing to commit will increase your access to desirable partners. Also being somebody who, when we look at cross-cultural studies of mate preferences, some of the things that women really value to a greater extent than men are things like provisioning ability. So having a job, being somebody who's ambitious, right? Have goals. So and it doesn't mean that you have to be wealthy, right? It means that you have to have something that you're committed to doing, and that you have to be committed to achieving, right? So having goals in your life, having ambition, being somebody who's able to support yourself and be able to potentially support offspring. These are the kinds of qualities that women tend to value in their choice of long-term romantic partners, expressing those qualities. When we look at different things that men and women both prioritize in their relationship, like one of the things that men and women both want and actually value above almost anything else is kindness and understanding. Right. So being a good, kind human being. And this doesn't mean that you need to be like a pushover and, Mr. Nice Guy who's like, because you can be, too nice. Right. And that's the person who's just like, oh, I have no spine. Like, whatever you want, dear. Like, women don't want that, because that's like a generally a sign that there's a mate value discrepancy, because, if he's letting you roll all over him, you're probably can do better, right? Because he's holding on to you for dear life and trying to do anything to make you happy, because he doesn't have a lot of alternatives. So that's you don't want to do that. But just being a good human, being a kind person who is polite, is nice to the wait staff, is nice to the valets, who's nice to people in service positions who are doing things that you wouldn't want to do yourself, and who treats their family, their friends, and you well. Like, that's going to make you do pretty well as a man. And then also, women also like qualities that are related to protection. When we look at some of the things that make women's mate preferences different than men's mate preferences, it is this prioritization of cues related to protection and provisioning, which historically, throughout most of our evolutionary history, played a really important role in a woman's own survival, but also the survival of her offspring. And so, go to the gym, go for a run, lift a weight. Lift a couple of weights. All of these things can improve on some of these qualities that women desire in their partners. And, if you add that to also being like a good human who's like kind to other people, and you're willing to invest in a woman and commit, like, you're going to do pretty well. Right? Like, I don't know, I don't know that I've ever encountered a man where I have thought, like, you know what, if you were ambitious and went to the gym and were a nice person and willing to commit, that you wouldn't be able to do pretty well. I mean, it's really not that hard. I think that a lot of people just don't want to do the work.
Yeah, it's simple but difficult. It's basically developing your physique for the protective element. Mm-hmm. Have a plan. Get your act together, like you're going somewhere. You don't necessarily need to be there now, but just you're going somewhere. That's attractive because of the resources I'm suggesting. And then finally, develop a sense of character. Be kind. Have some love. Be firm in your so I think it's a combination of physical protectiveness, and then be a good person, like you said, with kindness and with honesty, and developing yourself character-wise.
Yeah, and I feel like all of these things are within a person's control. I feel like men can do, anybody who's listening to this, if they want to improve their ability to attract partners, has it within their ability to be able to do that. Those are things that are available to everyone.
Yeah, I love the question, how can I find the right partner? Instead of asking yourself, how can I find the right partner? How can I develop myself in a partner that will get a partner, instead of focusing outward, focusing on yourself.
Right. No, 100%. I think that's true. I think men and women do that a lot, both, right? Where they're looking for how to find the right partner without really focusing on how can I make myself into the person I want to spend the rest of my life with. And I think that each one of us can really benefit from asking ourselves, like, how can I make myself someone that I want to spend the rest of my life with? And then, because that's also, of course, going to make you more attractive to other people who want to then spend the rest of their life with you, or even, just the evening. Like, I want to find some people who want to spend the evening with me. Making yourself into the type of person that, would be good company. I think, is something that we can all have a little bit more control over. I think that dating and relationships sometimes can feel like they're totally out of our control, right? And that we're just at the whims of other people's desires. But it's like we have a lot more control over those outcomes than we think that we do.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that gives, making that link of like where you are at in your life now. Like if you can still work towards getting your ideal partner, but like if you make that link that the actions and behaviors I'm doing today with my life, that's going to influence that in the future. I think I have a final 2 questions more, but one is about if I'm a man in a relationship with a woman and to understand women's hormones, what would you suggest men could be to become better partners of their wives or their girlfriends?
Right. Yeah, I think that this is a really great question. I think that understanding the cyclical nature of cycling women is hugely advantageous to men, both in terms of understanding their partners and then also being able to be better, more understanding partners. And so, one of the things that was most surprising to me when I released my first book, This Is Your Brain on Birth Control, is I have one chapter talking about the cyclical nature of women's sexual desire and how sexual desire peaks right prior to ovulation and then it decreases in the luteal phase of the cycle. I got so many emails from men telling me how eye-opening this was and how much pressure it took off them and their relationship because they were, they felt like they couldn't understand or predict how their partner was feeling about them. And it was really putting a lot of pressure on themselves where they would start questioning the relationship. And then they'd be putting pressure on their partner only because they were looking for validation, because they were feeling insecure, because they were feeling like all of a sudden their partner didn't like them. And so I think that it was really surprising to me how many men were like, oh my gosh, like this was a total game changer for me. It was this one chapter. And so, you can read The Period Brain. You can read This Is Your Brain on Birth Control. It'll give you all of the hot insight. And I really do think that understanding how women's brains and bodies are working as a hormone cycle is incredibly illuminating in terms of helping you understand that, yes, sexual desire is not the same every day. And there are times when it's really hot and heavy, and then there's other times when it runs cooler. And understanding that it's not about you and it's not about the relationship, but instead it's about what's happening hormonally, I think can really take a lot of pressure off of men. And it can take pressure off men from putting pressure on their partners. So I think that it can also just lead to better dynamics that way. It can also, because there are things that happen with mood. So one of the things that happens in the second half of the menstrual cycle is that the fear center in women's brains actually becomes more functionally interconnected with a greater number of brain regions in the last 2 weeks of the cycle. So the 2 weeks leading up to the period. And during this time, women are more sensitive to signs of potential threat within their relationship in particular. Because again, this is a time in the cycle when women's brains and bodies are orienting and preparing for the possibility of pregnancy, which is a time when women are incredibly needful for, especially historically, for male protection and provisioning. And so women become very sensitive to any cue that there might be something amiss within their relationship. And so you can kind of think about it almost as a smoke detector that becomes overly sensitive. And we've all had one of those, right? Where you have the house and you have the smoke detector where anytime you make a bag of popcorn, that it goes off and you're having to wave your arm around in front of it and you're like, it's not a fire, it's just a popcorn, right? And then you'll have other smoke detectors that only go off when there's actually a fire, right? And it's like the smoke detector in our brain becomes more sensitive in the second half of the cycle. And so even if you're just making popcorn, right? So you tell your partner like, "Hey, I'm staying late at work tonight, da 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 da." Right? Your partner, who might not normally, in the first half of the cycle, might say, "Okay, that's fine, see you later." Right? Her smoke detector is more finely attuned in the second half of the menstrual cycle, which can make even things that didn't normally seem like they were a big deal all of a sudden feel like they're a big deal. And so I think that understanding that too is that like understanding that there are certain times in the cycle where your partner's fear centers of her brain are more sensitive. That's helpful information to have because it can help you better understand, like, wait a minute, like what? Oh, okay. I know. Okay. I understand this. Okay. And then you can ask yourself, because a lot of times with women especially in the second half of the menstrual cycle, when their fear centers are more finely attuned to even subtle signs of threat, generally these boil down to two issues, right? Does she feel safe? Does she feel secure? And then being able to recognize that this isn't about, the fact that I'm staying late at work, or this isn't about the fact that I forgot to empty the dishwasher. This is about my partner needing to feel safe and secure in the relationship. And so the way to solve the problem isn't with the dishwasher, right? The way to solve the problem is to affirm to your partner how much the relationship means to you and how they're safe with you. And that really can ultimately diffuse almost any situation. And so I think that really recognizing what the wisdom is behind the menstrual cycle, right? Because it is orienting our brains to sex and attraction in the first half, and then implantation and pregnancy in the second half. Understanding that that's making our brain and our body shift gears in ways that are really predictable once you actually understand them. And then being able to be empathetic and being able to discuss those changes and also just use them to understand, you and how you fit into the relationship with your partner, I think can be absolutely game-changing for men.
So knowing where your partner is on the cycle could be absolute game changer.
I think it is. I mean, in my own relationships, it has been, and my husband is like knows my cycle better than I do at this point, just because of how dialed in he is to all of that, and it's so helpful. It's helpful to him, and it's helpful to me, and it doesn't give me permission to be a horrible shrew, 2 weeks out of the cycle, but instead, it's like if there's something where I'm more sensitive than normal, he knows exactly what it is. And he knows the way to solve the problem, right? And it's about safety and security. It always boils down to those things, and being able to address those things instead of whatever superficial dumb bullshit that I think it's about, like didn't empty the dishwasher, and actually get to the heart of the matter is a game changer. And certainly it's a game changer with respect to sexual intimacy within relationships. It's a game changer with respect to understanding workouts, like we talked about, like for women themselves. I mean, there's just so much to be gained from really understanding what's happening biologically.
Yeah, 100%. I wish I would have had the maturity. I mean, some of this is more recent work, but having the maturity when I was in my long-term relationship a couple of years ago to be able, because I think that would have saved me a lot of just becoming a better partner, understanding my former girlfriend at the time. It would be definitely. Yeah. Well, the last question, I did this game called Unlock. So it's basically a conversational game that asks meaningful questions. I'm going to end with one random question for you.
All right, let's hear it.
What is something you once believed to be true, but have changed your mind about?
Oh, wow. Okay, that's a really interesting question. And there's a lot of things about this. I just want you to give me a second. Let me think about it. Okay, I'll tell you one. And there's a lot of things. I've changed my tune on so many different things. But one of the things that I have changed my tune on, and I don't know if this is going to be helpful at all to anybody who's listening, but I used to be very much a nativist, meaning that I thought that when it came to things like writing and creativity. So I always was like, you come into the world and you either have these, like you're going to be a good writer or you're creative or you're not. And I thought that these were things that could not be learned. And I've since learned, since I've mentored so many PhD students now working under me, and in science, the ability to write well and the ability to be creative are things that are incredibly paramount to be able to be successful. And I was always under the impression that you either had these things or you didn't, and I have learned by watching my students that just is not true. Like that, you can learn almost anything, and you can even learn creativity, and there's ways to unlock that. And I've seen people grow in those ways where for so long I thought they were just fixed.
I think it's a great response. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sarah, I
Great.
think every woman and man who are listening to this or watching this should read both of your books, the first one and the second one. I think it's a game changer, although I'm not a woman, so I can say, but I can understand intellectually that could be a game changer for women. And also it's just so interesting. It's just, it's half of the population who are behave like that. The hormones affect them in the way that is different from men in general. And I think it's so interesting. So if I think you care about human behavior and being the best possible partner and being able to attract the best possible partner and being the best as a woman, the version of yourself to buffer the effects that the second half of the cycle has on you, they should absolutely read your work. And I'm so glad that we talked. And I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, Sarah, for your work and your contribution throughout. I know how hard work it takes to do everything that you're doing, and I can hear how passionate you're about it, both in your writing and when you talk about it. And thank you for updating my worldview and view of understanding women, and that will be a game changer in my life, and I can't wait to apply it when I get a partner one day in my life. So I just want to end this conversation by saying from the bottom of my heart, thank you, Sarah.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.